I want to do a poll, because we did this yesterday, and it was very insightful. Okay, I'm pushing up a poll. Have you personally been affected by overt, so that's just outward, it could be verbal aggression, it could be physical aggression, overt racism, or systemic racism, where you've experienced barriers to full participation here in Canada. Yesterday, it was in two of the classes that we polled, it was hovering at around just below 50%. And today, overwhelmingly, we've got not quite double, but getting close to a 2-to-1 ratio. And that's clearly unacceptable. That's pointing to, I'm really shamed by that response, but I think it's important that we see these kinds of numbers, because there's often an assumption on the part of Canadians, white Canadians, to delude themselves into thinking that racism isn't really a problem in Canada. I'm sure you've encountered that. I know that I've felt that mistakenly. And clearly, in the polling that I've been doing in the last day and today, it's pointing to a very different reality. And so we have these forces at work in our society that are hurtful. And that's almost, that's well more than half the class who've been hurt by this. That's not the kind of world that I want to live in. That's not the kind of country that I want to stand behind and promote. That's not a country that I can feel proud of. And so people like me need to do more. And oftentimes, I must admit, it's difficult to know how to begin. Where do you start? And once you have the academic tools, you understand the history, colonial damage that it's caused. On an academic level, once you understand that, what do you do with that knowledge? And I think it turns towards activism. And I think I will stop on that word, because we have a very special guest in the person of Artivist, and I will let Quentin explain what that is. We have Artivist Quentin Vercety here with us today. I just want to say I had to write a list down because he's got qualifications that are a mile long. Quentin is a writer, he's a musician, a performer, he is, as I said earlier, an artivist who uses art to drive social change. Quentin Afrofuturist, I'll let him explain that. He's an educator, he's a community builder, a leader. Quentin is a truth teller, he's a multiple award winner, and he's the co-founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement. Quentin is a close friend and a genuine, caring soul with a strong moral and spiritual grounding. The work that he does is all aimed at making this place better for us all. And I'll tell you, from the bottom of my heart, my own life has been greatly enriched for having had the good fortune of having shared a little tiny slice of the road of life with Quentin. He was recently won the honor of commemorating the life of escaped African slave Joshua Glover in a statue that will be installed at the Montgomeryan Museum in Etobicoke. So please give a great big warm virtual George Brown welcome to Artivist Quentin Vercety. There, you're getting the love now, Quentin.
I'm feeling it. All right, thank you. So first of all, greetings, wagwan, bonjour. I'm Quentin Vercety, and I am honored to speak with everyone here. I speak to y'all from indigenous lands, and I speak to you in the name of my ancestors, and in honor of all those who have come before me. And today, in all my bodies, I'm feeling truly blessed and honored. This is a huge honor because I was a student of Mr. Jim Kenney, and he also deeply impacted my life and also changed my perspective on a lot of different things, but mainly on allyship and what that truly means, in the sense of someone seeing me not just for who I was or where I was coming from or from the circumstances that I came from or how I represented myself, but truly seeing the potential in me and allowing me to make the decision to see that potential, actualize that potential, rather than forcing me, because sometimes, people will see something in someone and push them to see that for themselves versus allowing that person to see that for themselves. And so thank you, Mr. Jim Kenny. You have made a big impact on allowing me to be where I am today. So today I want to speak about imagination, because a lot of my work is about the imagination and spiritual connection. I know some people might relate spiritual connection and imagination to certain type of definitions, and I want to just emphasize that everything I share is of my own opinion, and feel free to ask me questions. Feel free to challenge me on them. I will respectfully answer or decline to answer, which is still an answer. Yeah, I'm all about conversation, so I don't want to take up too much space because I want to engage, because I want to make sure what I'm saying is being understanded and overstanded, as we like to say in my culture. I'm of Jamaican descent. So it's not enough to understand something, right? Because when you're under it, that means you're being influenced by it. So when you're over it, you now can actually do something with it. So we want you to overstand and understand within yourself. And so I want to start with this clip by Sun Ra, a film that I saw actually around the same time I met Mr. Jim Kenny. My story is one where I came from a certain scenario where I was in a neighborhood called Rexdale in the west end, northwest end of Toronto, where we weren't given a lot of options. It was a very disenfranchised neighborhood, and there was a lot of drugs in my neighborhood, and and because of the drugs and the poverty in my neighborhood, because we didn't have access to certain resources, and it's also what you would consider, it's kind of like a economical desert in the sense of the opportunity to actual jobs, careers was really rare, unless you're doing agency work, which is oftentimes warehouse work or construction. But the issue was it's a desert in the sense of access from Rexdale at the time when I was growing up to the industrial areas and the larger economy was really difficult, because you had to take at least 3 buses just to get to Kipling Station and just to get downtown or to get to certain areas of the city. So we were very remote, and it actually was considered one of the murder capitals for many years in terms of the leading wards for crime, bigger than Jane and Finch, and bigger than other places in the city. And because of the poverty and such young demographic, we still have the highest crime, one of the highest crime rates, and also one of the largest youth demographic, with I think up to 60 or 70% of the population is under the age of 40. And Rexdale also has a lot of halfway houses, which is, if you don't know what halfway houses are, it's basically when you're released from prison and you don't have anywhere to go, and you are kind of like under house arrest or you're under probation, this is where you'll go. So there's a lot of reoffenders that live in the area, or felons. But if you have no resources and the only thing access to you is criminal activities, then you're bound to reoffend. And so I found myself caught up at a young age, at the age of 12, actually younger than that, at the age of 9, being caught up into this world where a lot of my older cousins were involved in gangs and in certain activities where by default I joined into those things. And so at a young age, I thought that's all I could be. Long story short, I dropped out of high school at the age of 16, and I was on the streets for a bit, where there was an incident where a close friend of mine got killed right beside me. Like, I was at a party and he got shot, and because I was a witness to the crime, there was like a fair. Well, actually, I was accused by the police of being involved in his murder, and that was a whole situation where I was being targeted because I wasn't cooperating with the police. But also there was just all this issue of like, he saw what happened, who did it. So there was this fear overall of my family and just industry and everything of me also being the next person to be killed. And so my mom sent me away to New York to go to school there, and it didn't make any difference, because that's where actually I would say I experienced the most racism, because it was one, I'm like this Toronto kid who thinks he's a gangster, the skinny little scrawny Toronto kid who thought he was a gangster in New York. And this is upstate New York, like Albany, Syracuse, which is like also prison cities. Those are where some of the larger prisons are outside of, other than Rikers Island. And so there's some pretty serious people over there. And and the school that I went to just like didn't make the cut for me. But it also allowed me to see who I truly was and what I wanted to be. And I realized art was my way out, in the sense of actualizing my potential. And so while I was there in New York, I came across this movie by Sun Ra. And I want to play a quick clip for you guys.
Love is, that's the way love is. Yeah, chew up, chew up, chew up.
Oh man, this man's gonna run out on me. class, but that's a trip still. You know,
It's not worth it. It's not worth it at all. All right, take it over, fellas, yeah. It's all right, yeah.
Greetings, black youth, planet Earth.
What it is.
I am Sun Ra, ambassador from the intergalactic regions of the Council of Outer Space.
Why are your shoes so big?
Are those moon shoes?
How do we know you for real?
Yeah, how we know you ain't somebody off Telegraph Street, some old hippie or something?
Where are you? I mean, we don't know that.
She for real?
He might have something going for him.
Yeah, we sure
Oh,
don't.
what kind of shoes is that you got on your feet?
Yeah, walking around all these funny clothes. Shoot, I know I probably take off running. I seen somebody walking down the street coming, talking all that mess to me, talking about going to outer space.
I mean, yeah, what it is. That's what it is. What it is.
Talking about Telegraph Street. We don't know what you are.
How do you know I'm real?
Yes.
I'm not real. I'm just like you. You don't exist in this society. If you did, your people wouldn't be seeking equal rights. You're not real. If you were, you'd have some status among the nations of the world. So we're both myths. I do not come to you as a reality. I come to you as the myth, because that's what black people are, myths. I came from a dream that the black man dreamed long ago. I'm actually a present sent to you by your ancestors. I'm gonna be here till I pick out certain one of you to take back with me.
What if we won't come? You gonna make us come?
Then I'm gonna have to do you like they did you in Africa. Chain you up, take you with me.
Are there any whiteys up there?
They're walking there today.
That's right.
They take frequent trips to the moon. I notice none of you have been invited. How do you think you're gonna exist? The year 2000 is right around the corner.
What's that crystal thing in your hand?
We're living in the space age. We're living in the space age. We're living in a space age.
So Sun Ra is from the future, where black people ended up, because of the condition in the world, they ended up deciding, like, you know what, we're better off on a whole different planet, doing our own thing, but only the people with the highest frequency. So on Saturn, they start to flourish. And the idea was, he's like, you know what, let me go back in time, or go back through time and space, because time has collapsed in accordance to African traditions. The past, present, and future all correlate. And let me help to raise the frequency of those who didn't want to leave planet Earth in order to help them see the potential. And so in that clip, he's dressed all funky with like these Egyptology type inspired clothing. And they're like, man, you're not real. And he's like, yeah, I'm just like you. You're not real. And he's like, you know, if you were real, you wouldn't be fighting for your status in the world. You wouldn't be fighting for human rights. You wouldn't be fighting. You would have your own nation. You would be recognized as humans and people, and would have your own history that's not linked to oppression. And he's like, you know what? I'm just like you. I'm a myth. I don't exist. I'm a legend. And so throughout the movie, he goes on to try to demystify the myth of blackness and black people and people of African descent and people of color not existing, but making sure they realize that they exist to themselves. Once you acknowledge that you exist, then it's easier, or it's less of a challenge. Let me not say easier, but then it's less of a challenge to then allow other people to see your existence. Because what has happened through slavery is that, or the enslavement of humans from Africa, is that they weren't seen as human beings, right? They were seen as chattel. And so the reason that related to the imagination for me was because I was seeing myself being limited to a certain situation. I thought all I could be is an athlete or a drug dealer or, you know, a criminal of some sort. Whereas I started to see myself more and start to see my own potential for myself. And so, yeah, it's been a 10-year journey of growth, of reimagining and demystifying this idea of not existing, and exploring the different ways I can exist, and exploring the different ways that can continue to reach for the stars in a lot of ways. And so I want to start off with showing you this collection of my business cards. And every year, so I came back, So before I jump into my story too far, I came back from the States in 2009, roughly end of 2008, going into 2009. And that's when I enrolled back into high school. And basically, I realized I wasn't dumb. I was hustling in the States. I was making money. I was doing a lot of different things, but I realized I was actually smart. And it was just because of like the different people I was meeting. I realized I had people skill. I realized I was really social. I realized I was artistic. I realized I was poetic. I realized I could rap. I realized I could make music. And I was like, yo, this whole time I was told I was stupid and I'm not dumb. I was like, you know what? Let me at least get my high school diploma. When I was 18 years old, I decided to get back into high school. And the school I enrolled in was called Nelson A. Boylan, which sadly no longer exists. It was one of the schools that got closed down. But there was a fast track program that I was able to be a part of that allowed me to get double the amount of credits, basically. One of the programs I got involved in was called dual credit, which allowed me to go to George Brown and get a high school credit and a college credit. And this was a big deal for me because, again, it expanded my imagination of my potential and of who I could be. Because I never ever in my life thought about going to university or into any post-secondary institution because, one, not to say I didn't have the money, but I didn't see the value in it. And at the time when I came back to Toronto, I didn't have the money. And so I was just like, yo, there's no way I'm going to pay thousands of dollars someone to tell me what to do, you know? Because in my mind, I'm my own boss, I'm my own man, et cetera, et cetera. And so the dual credit program really changed my perspective on post-secondary because I thought it was just a place for elitists and for white people. And I kid you not, at the time in my neighborhood, I grew up literally, like my whole building is like 6 floors and it's about 1,000 units. It's a complex and it's all black folks. So I never really had any like friends who weren't black. And so going to George Brown was like a shock. Even my school, Nelson A. Boylan, was predominantly black. There was like black and Arabs. And when I say black, I mean like people from the continent. There's a lot of Somalis and West African folks from Ghana and Nigeria, a couple Senegalese people, and then a lot of Caribbean folks, a lot of folks from Jamaica. But then also I met black Canadians, which was like, I was like, whoa, there's a thing called black Canadians? Like you guys, y'all been here? Y'all folks been here like for hundreds of years? Crazy. And so, yeah, going to George Brown was a shock for me. Like the dual credit program for me was a shock because I was really suspect of every person who was not black that was actually willing to help me, you know, and actually was willing to see me as me, even though I didn't know who me was at the time. The dual credit program I started in 2010, and that's where I met Mr. Jim Kenny. And eventually, I was able to. He saw the potential in me and asked me to be his teaching assistant, his student assistant. And that's also where I really started to flourish in terms of exploring the medium of graphic design and digital applications and learning different programs. Just realized I had this whole hunger for knowledge and just really wanted to expand my creative expression. And so my first business card came out of George Brown and going into the Remix Project, which was a youth program. And so essentially, once my imagination started to expand, I started to look at the different connections, the different ways that I was being limited and placing limits on myself, and how can I break out of those limits. And I was looking at solutions, looking at the different creative ways that I can create solutions and not create excuses, essentially. Graphic design really helped me with that because it made me realize like my creative body and my creative self has no limits. Even if, God forbid, the KKK popped up, they can't stop me from being creative. Even if I was thrown in prison, I could never be stopped. No one can stop my creativity. Jay-Z said an amazing line. He's like, trap my body but can't lock my mind, you know? Or trap my body but you can't, you know, lock my soul. And that really resonated with me, you know? And so that's when I started to get really interested in this idea of Afrofuturism and exploring self, you know, and really starting to invest in myself. And so over the years, as my style developed and evolved, I was like, yo, I want to reflect this in my business and how I present myself to people. So every time they meet me and I give them, even if I saw them already, even if they already know me, I'm giving them a new business card to let them know this is another person you're dealing with. This is an involved person that you're dealing with. This is not the same person you dealt with before. Because it's also then changing your imagination of me. And so, yeah, each year I start to build upon the previous year and the work continued to grow and grow. And so I'm going to speak more about my work and how it relates to, I guess, essentially the foundations of Black Lives Matter and Afrofuturism and larger ideas. And feel free to post questions and I'll try to answer them as we go. As Mr. Jim Kenny said, one of the founders of the Black Speculative Arts Movement. And I got involved in that around 2014, where I realized I was really knee deep into Afrofuturism. And Afrofuturism, on a basic level, is speculative or imaginative representation and storytelling about people of African descent inspired by African culture, histories, people, tradition, and land and resources. Afrofuturism has now expanded as a movement and as a theoretical way of thinking beyond just the future. It's also speaking about reimagining the past and also reimagining the present. So, example of this is rest in peace, Chadwick Boseman as a Black Panther. That movie is an example of Afrofuturism because it reimagined Africa, past, present. The movie is not taking place in the future. It's taking place actually in the year that we're living in, right? It's contemporary. But everything that we saw in it was speculative. Everything that we saw in it was imaginative based on African concepts. So everything in the movie was based on tribes and actual history from Africa. So the idea of like a place that was never colonized in Africa was based on Ethiopia and also Liberia. But Liberia is a different story, but Ethiopia specifically, and how Ethiopia was one of the first modern countries in Africa, and then et cetera, et cetera. The heart-shaped herb, the vibranium represents, the metaphors of bauxite and all the different precious metals that is being currently exploited from Africa, et cetera, et cetera. Even the costumes were inspired and everything. I got really interested in this world of Afrofuturism, but I was like, I want to see what other people think, because I realized I was coming about it from a very Caribbean, Pan-African and Caribbean perspective, and I wanted to know like what is unique. And a lot of the Afrofuturism at the time that was coming out and the representation that was coming specifically from America. And I was like, yo, like there's an imbalance, you know what I mean? There's an imbalance of like expression because blackness is not only limited to America and it's not a monolith. And so it was important for me to create a platform where other people can then have a conversation. Because one thing that post-secondary taught me, and being at George Brown and then also then later on going to OCAD University, was the academia world is about conversation. It's a tool to be in conversation with those who came before you and those who might come after you. And it's like a conversation of how can we build upon previous knowledge. And so to me, I was like, oh, that's pretty Afrofuturistic. But within the post-secondary or within the academia world, I realized there was a very limited conversation around visual arts and a conversation amongst artists and their works. And so what I wanted to do was look at public art and how art is accepted. I realized art from an imaginative standpoint of Black people, by Black people, for Black people, was not being showcased enough and was not being highlighted enough. And I realized there was all these systemic issues at the AGO with the ROM. I found out about the ROM Into the Heart of Africa exhibit that happened in 1990 and the riots that took place after that and the protesting that took place after that because of that. And I learned about there's something similar that happened at the AGO where they represented a really skewed and racist perspective about Black people from a colonial gaze without having Black people's input. I found it really important to want to represent and create a platform, essentially. That platform turned into Black Future Month, and Black Future Month is what led to me starting to get into conversation with people from across the world who were interested in my work and hearing about my work, and it led into the Black Speculative Arts Movement, where I did the exhibition in New York on the anniversary of the 95th Harlem Renaissance anniversary in Harlem, New York at the Schomburg Research Center. From there, with the Black Future Month, going into the Black Speculative Arts Movement, we collectively realized there was a need to redefine Afrofuturism as something that was Pan-African and not just American, and then also collapsing the idea of time, but then also speaking to using the visuals and using the movement of literature, cinema, etc., as a deeper commentary on what's happening in the world today. And so one of the key things for us was publishing. Dr. Ronaldo Anderson is the other founder in the States. And so he published Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Astral Black. And again, that's an ode to Octavia Butler and to Sun Ra. And another book that I'm published in is The Cosmic Underground, a grimoire of Black speculative discontent. And this was an exhibition that I was a part of in 2015 in Harlem. And I was the only Canadian in that exhibition next to Nala Hopkinson, who didn't exhibit any work, but she has her book covers in this catalog. And so I contributed several definitions to this book, The Black Speculative Arts Movement. And one of the key things was a definition called Sankophonology, which is, again, how the past, present, and future connects based on an African concept called Sankofa. And Sankofa is represented in semiotics or as a icon in two ways. And one is a bird that's looking back, almost like a swan or like a goose looking back, and it has an egg in its mouth. And the egg represents future, represents potential, it represents possibilities, opportunities, etc., etc. And it's reaching back for those things. And the idea is that the phrase is it's not taboo to go and fetch what you have forgot. And so the other symbol is the original heart symbol. And you can look it up. You can find it on Google if you type in Sankofa, Sankofa. And also there's an article that I wrote that defines Sankophonology more in depth. And the second symbol is a heart symbol. And the heart symbol has twirls going inwards into the inside, and then on the bottom part it twirls outwards. And it's the idea of you go into your spirit or into your ancestral space. Or if you watch Black Panther, which I definitely encourage everyone to watch it, the ancestral plane. So that's the spiritual space. You go into your own ancestral space, whether it's meditation, whether it's just brainstorming, etc., but you're going into a spiritual, into an internal place, a place that's timeless, essential. And then you take in the knowledge and the wisdom and the understanding from that place, and you're turning it into action. And so I had those definitions in the book. And so I further expanded upon a lot of my work of like trying to create platforms in the community and trying to expand the imagination of the community abroad. Not just the Black community, but also all communities of how we think about Black people, and that's also how we think about Black people's place in the future. And so this is another book that I've been published in. But one of the main things that my work about is looking at Canadian monuments, because I realized in Canada, when I was at OCAD actually, I was really intrigued by the lack of representation in the public. Like I said, I was really focused on the access to Black representation and the access to art. And that's why I started to create art shows. Well, those art shows came from being able to walk around, because I went to South Africa in 2010 once I graduated. So if we're going back to my business cards. So after this part, I jumped here, and this is when I started to re-inspect myself. And I started to re-inspect myself when I went to Africa, to South Africa specifically, and to Zimbabwe, where I was trying to find out about my African roots and learn about more about the continent and the diversity of the continent. And so I realized everywhere I went, there was like monuments. There was tributes to history everywhere. And I was like, yo, this is crazy, because I never thought I would see that in Africa, because I was very ignorant. And I was also I didn't think there was going to be such a balance of I guess the modern development of cities and also a balance of rural, and the rural not being looked down upon, because they realize you need the rural in order to have the maintenance of the city, because one feeds the other and vice versa. And then also there's a respect for the reverence of like those who live in mountains and et cetera, like everyone has their place. And so, but one of the things that was common, especially with amongst the Xhosa people, Ndebele people, and even trans people, was having access to see your culture represented everywhere you are. And so I realized Canada had an overall lack of monuments of people of African descent. I realized it's an act of erasure, based on my studies, based on the conversations I was getting into in post-secondary, based on the things I was researching, like Tanya Ennis and her essay. And so I realized also Toronto was the only major city in the world that doesn't have any monuments of people of African descent, and that there was over 200 monuments in the greater Toronto area. And I was like, yo, this is crazy because it's like we boast so much about multiculturalism, but yet we don't see that in the landscape. And so my research was really simple. I went to the website of toronto.ca and I looked at the public art map and I literally sat there in my undergrad in 2012 and I was like, okay, there has to be something that tells a story about Black people in Toronto. Like where are the histories? Like, you know, where are the stories about these people? And I went through and I'm like, white people. I'm like, oh snap, okay, there's some Asian people. Okay, oh, there's some Indian folks. Like, and I'm like, okay, that's cool. But I'm like, yo, we've been here as long as the European settlers. I found out about someone named Matthew DaCosta. From a show of hands, does anyone know who Matthew DaCosta is? Does anyone know who have anyone heard of the name Matthew DaCosta? So, and I realized that's one of the greatest, I'm gonna say this honestly, it's one of the greatest injustice in Canadian history. And the reason I say that is because Matthew DaCosta, and I'm gonna try to pull up a picture. Matthew DaCosta was the translator and the original discoverer of Quebec he traveled with Samuel du Champlain. And he was a liaison for the indigenous people and the early European settlers. And so he also was known to speak over 11 languages, European languages, and it's unknown how many African languages he spoke, and it's unknown how many indigenous languages he spoke. But he came here to Canada in 1605. The first African slave that came from Africa to the Americas as a resident or as, you know, taken from Africa was in, sorry, no, that's not him, was in 1625. So Matthew Costa came here to Canada 20 years prior to the first slave in America. And for whatever reason, there's a bridge, there's statues of Samuel de Champlain, there's bridges and statues of and streets and parks named after Pierre and all these other French and English explorers, but nothing of Matthew DaCosta. And what was interesting about Matthew DaCosta is that he also came here with his own ship of Moors. And I don't know if anyone knows about the Moors. But the Moors were the first people to circumference to travel around the world, and they also taught a lot of the Spaniards and the Portuguese how to travel and create boats that could travel across the ocean, which later on Christopher Columbus, etc., was able to travel, right, to India, etc. But they already established those routes, right, because the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages was when the Moors were pretty much running Europe, right? So also to call it Dark Ages was also racist, just if folks didn't know. So anyways, Matthew DaCosta came to Canada in 1605 with a ship of Black folks, and he was already speaking the language of the indigenous people. So if this Black man already spoke the languages of the people of Canada, how could that be? That means he actually came here before Samuel de Champlain. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to folks? Does that logic make sense? It's crazy that we're not taught about him, right? Like in Black Month, we're not taught about. We don't know what country he came from because he has so many different documentations. So we know that he worked for the Dutch, for the Netherlands, and also for Holland. We also know that he worked for the Spaniards, but we don't know exactly what country he came from. It's suspected that he came from Spain because he came on the ship with Moors, and the Moors were greatly heavily in Spain at the time, but we don't know what country he originated from, and we don't know how. And yeah, perhaps North Africa as well. We just know that he's not Arab for sure. He was definitely a dark-skinned man, and he spoke multiple languages, and very few documentation about him. Again, and I was just looking at like the missing histories of Canada. I was like shocked when I went on the Toronto's website. I'm like, yo, where is the history? Like, you know what I mean? And like, where are the representations? Like, what did these people look like? You know, what did they wear? Like, you know, like what was their histories? You know? And so I was just really shocked because again, when I went to South Africa, when I went to like different parts in Asia, when I went to different parts in South America, I just saw the history reflected in the landscape a lot, but in Canada. And so essentially my work started to look at, well, I started to find plaques, and plaques are not considered to be public art. So that's why they didn't show up on the map. But I found a website that documented some of the Toronto plaques that paid homage to the history in Toronto. And there's also other websites. But I was like, man, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, George Brown doesn't count. Shout out George Brown for being an abolitionist. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's only 10 plaques in all Toronto, or 11 plus the page I'm on. And I was like, yo, there has to be more history than that. And so I started to realize that it's important for me to then tell that history. And so my work started to jump into creating monuments. I created a series of work called Outside in the Republic. And the idea of the Afrotopia, which is a play on the utopia. The Afrotopia is just basically the ideal space for Black people to exist and where they feel like they are invested in. So one of the first pieces I made was myself, reimagining myself as Sun Ra. And so if I go back to the pictures of my business cards, you'll see. So if you go back to 2014, you'll see that, you know, I just started to explore these ideas of monuments even further. And so I started to want to represent young people, you know, and specifically young women. But I realized there wasn't enough monuments and tribute to Black women in the landscape. There's a term by Kimberly Crenshaw called intersectionality. And intersectionality is a really important term in the work of decolonization and anti-Black racism and any of the type of work that we're trying to do to create social change. And intersectionality on a basic level is looking at how do different systems of oppression affect people on different angles. And so for Black women, especially if we're talking about queer Black women, if we're talking about ableism, et cetera, Black women are at the largest. And if you want to go further, Black queer, femme, trans folks are the largest intersection. And then if you want to go further, folks with different abilities, you know, different able bodies, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so the idea of tackling social change is also thinking about intersectionality. And so I wanted to start representing these ideas of intersectionality in my work through using metaphors, you know. So this person who I represented at the time, she was in a wheelchair, and it's not that she was amputated or anything like that, but I wanted to play around this idea of where she felt like she was separated from her body when she was in a wheelchair, but she felt like music as an artist and stuff was the extension of her body. So as you heard me say earlier, the creative body, and how I felt limitless in my creative body despite whatever oppression that I face or despite whatever barriers that I occurred. And so I wanted to show these representations of people, young people who I know. I did 3D scans earlier, and then as my skills developed, I started to do actual sculpting, 3D sculpting. But I wanted to show these representations of young people in these ways because I wanted to expand their imagination of their representation. And so again, if going back to my business cards in 2016, again, expanding how I represented myself. This piece, really quick, I was on the verge of graduating from OCAD University, and a teacher said to me that she felt like I was racist. The teacher said that she felt like I was racist because all I did was represent Black people in my work. And I tried my best to explain, as simple as I can, that like based on systemic power structures, Black people can be discriminative, they can be prejudiced, but they can't be racist because the system of racism and the practice of racism did not originate and does not benefit Black people, right? And the system and structure of racism only benefits people of European descent, specifically what we call white folks. And so within the power dynamics, I don't have any influence on any governments. I don't have any influence, et cetera, you know, when we can go on and on. When I learned about Nike, the goddess of victory, I realized that she was taken from the concept from the Greeks and the Romans, was taken actually from the Yoruba culture, which came from the Yoruba, then traveled to Kemet. And then, of course, I hope everyone that Greeks and Romans based their whole culture an existence on ancient Kemet, which was ancient Egypt, right? Because that was 10,000 years or 6,000 years prior to Rome being built and prior to Greece. They were greatly influenced by the ancient Egyptians. The column that someone just asked in the work is the reclaiming, because I also went to Egypt, and it was a reclaiming of very Afrocentric things that was now being equated to European ideas, right? So the idea of classical art, the idea of neoclassical, and always being referred to the Greeks and the Romans made no sense when the Egyptians were doing that thousands of years before them, right? And the very aesthetic that they use that we refer to as classical came from the ancient Kemet. And again, I'm not making these things up. In my research, I went to the place and I was like, what do you mean this is 10,000 BC? Fams, what are you talking about? How could that be? So it was perplexing to me, to say the least. Just going back to the final stuff I want to show and share with you. So my work just continued to be about expanding imagination and expanding representation. These are the books. So yeah, I was looking at the lack of representation of monuments, the lack of representation in Toronto, and just wanted to represent young people and represent different Black people in the Canadian landscape, and not even make it up, because oftentimes we feel like we have to make it up, and it's like, no, I'm just making up how I'm representing these people. This is a list of all the monuments that exist in Canada, and I can share this with Mr. Jim Kenny, and he can share that with you. And again, none of the monuments listed here are in Toronto. We have Ottawa, we have St. Catherine, we have Chatham, we have Edmonton, we have Montreal, we have Windsor, we have St. Catherine, we have all Quebec City, Montreal, St. Catherine, Liverpool, Annapolis, Royal, Nova Scotia, which is actually where Matthew DaCosta landed. And I'm honored to say that, 2021, I'll be creating one of Toronto's first monuments. But this is just a list of, as you can see on top of my list, Matthew DaCosta. So this is my short list of the Canadians who I feel like deserve to have monuments. And funny enough, Joshua Glover was not on my list, folks. He didn't even pop up on my radar. So I was just like, yo, this is crazy that that's the first monument that I'll be creating as Toronto's first monument, when there's all these other folks who I felt like is more worthy. So I hope that's just the beginning of the work, Again, just wanted to represent more women as monuments in the landscape. So this is like the idea of the Afrotopia, where they can express their culture. I want to have a quick pop quiz. Does anyone know why I represented these instruments? These women playing these instruments? So we have the sangba, drum, we have the saxophone, we have the kora. Well, yeah, so all of them have African origins, essentially. And so again, like I said, I wanted to reclaim a lot of these iconographs of what people think to be European, especially like the concept of a bus. And you can look it up. You don't I also encourage folks to fact check. Like, if you don't think what I'm saying is honest, or if you don't think what I'm saying is correct, I encourage you to fact check what I'm saying, because I also believe in learning through correction and also through conversation. And so I'm just gonna wrap this up so we can have some more back and forth conversations, and maybe Mr. Jim Kenny can jump in. I was actually excited about telling the story of Joshua Glover, because it was a huge challenge, because I was really trying really hard to step away from the slave narrative, the enslaved narrative. And because I realized in North America, there's a huge obsession with talking about slaves. And again, like I told you, Matthew DaCosta, who was the first Black person recorded in North America, was a free, contracted, paid man who came here with his own ship, which meant that he was also wealthy. And so I was like, why are we so caught up on the slave narrative and not speaking about these other narratives that speak about Black excellence that doesn't have to do with oppression? And so telling the Joshua Glover story as a monument was really interesting, because I was like, okay, damn, this is a challenge. How do I represent something new about the slave narrative, and the enslaved African? But more specifically, how do I push the imagination of the public to see this person beyond that title, because that shouldn't define who he is or his legacy. And so, using Afrofuturistic lens, I wanted to show a concept of transition and transformation. And so we see that he has chains around like a robotic arm, because Octavia Butler in one of her books, and also John Jennings in The Cosmic Underground, spoke about Black people coming to America, African people of African descent, coming to the Americas as machines, as robots, being seen as non-human, but instead as property, as objects, as technology. for white supremacy and for white patriarchy specifically. We see that Joshua Glover goes from being a machine because that machine represents, or that robot represents slavery. And so he goes from being that machine to then becoming human. We kind of see his flesh growing, and then we see like he's wearing a tattered canvas shirt. And that canvas shirt represents that he was a runaway. He's running away and he's kind of like in transition. And then that shirt turns into a suit based on the clothing that they would have wore at the time. Hence why he has the mutton chops. And that was all based on research, based on like what he would look like and the things that a gentleman or a dandy would wear, because he was working at the Montgomery Inn, which was kind of like the Ritz of that day, Tobacco. And so that was a big deal. He was one of the first black hotel managers actually in Toronto during that time period in the 1860s. I wanted to show this person in transformation and transition because it really reflected my story of where I felt like I was limited and in bondage to my circumstances, and then getting to a point where my creativity and my hunger for knowledge and learning allowed me to see my humanity and see that I wasn't just a black man, seeing that I wasn't just some, N-word or someone that just came from the hood or who made a lot of poor decisions in his youth, but someone who was on a path to self-discovery and helping others to discover their humanity and their connection and larger contribution to humanity and to this world while we're here. It was really interesting to represent Joshua Glover because even though I didn't want to represent another slave story, or I didn't feel like Toronto deserved another slave story, or people need to know another slave story, I was like, yo, it's not about a slave story, it's about a human being. I was like, yo, just that thinking of my own was a reflection of how much racism has affected the way I thought about people who look like me. Because that's only small blimp of our story. And really what my mission is to allow people to see beyond that, to see a human being again, to see someone who it was a part of our fabric of a society and who's constantly growing, right? Like his legacy is going to continue to change how we look at Toronto and our society as, in the sense of how society has changed, in the sense of what it means for this city to be one of the most multicultural cities in the world, right? And so I have these 3 flowers. You can't see the 4th one really well based on these angles, but we have these 3 flowers and it represents the places that he was. So from St. Missouri, which is where he was enslaved, to go into Ohio, to then come into Ontario, the Ontario Trillium. And in his hat is the hibiscus flower. And the hibiscus flower is a spiritual flower, but also a common flower in Africa. It's a Pan-African flower. In the Caribbean, we call it sorrel. And it's used as tea. It's a really tasty tea. And it's also used as medicine. And so I wanted to put that flower in his hat to say that Africa, his Africanness, his ancestors, his connection back to his roots and who he truly is still on top of his mind. So again, for decisions in my life and thinking about, the future for my children to come. And the book is going to be called Exported Pollen from Mercury. This is the work in progress. And I want to quickly share with y'all another work in progress as we speak about this concept of expanding imagination. As everyone knows in the world, we lost a really important actor within the Black community, Chadwick Boseman. And he played the Black Panther, and I'm currently working on a tribute statue for Chadwick Boseman. And a lot of people ask me, like, why is Chadwick Boseman important? And Chadwick Boseman is important for so many reasons, but simply the idea of despite suffering, despite hardship, despite whatever difficulty you're going through, you have to think about a bigger picture and know that you're not going through it alone. Black Panther was amazing because it connected us to imagination, all the different possibilities of what African representation could be, all the different ways that we can reimagine Black people in positive and reaffirming ways. And Chadwick Boseman was important because he only picked roles that he knew was going to mean something positive. He only picked positive roles. And I think as an artist, as a creative, and I think a part of our fight to improve humanity is to really focus on the positive. Like social media right now, they like to really hone in on the negative. And the thing is, going back to Sun Ra, the negative lowers our frequency. Focusing on the negative is never bring positive results. We can bring up the negative statistics, but then it's like, let's look at the positive. It's like, yes, I was a high school dropout, but I'm now completing my master's. Yes, I spent X amount of years involved in criminal activities, but then I decided to dedicate the rest of my years to uplifting others. That's a statistic. 5, 6 years in the streets versus 10 years plus of traveling around the world and trying to help people to see their connection to each other spiritually, ancestrally, and as humans. And I think that's the main thing I want to focus on, like that human connection. And I think the reason why a lot of people are going to mourn and celebrate at the same time Chadwick Boseman's life is because of the ways that he allowed us to connect to our own humanity and connect to our imagination. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Quentin. That was very powerful. I would just open the floor up to any questions.
Yeah, I'm also interested to know if anyone has ever come across any Afrofuturism content.
Nicholas says he has a question. How long did it take you to structure the model you just made?
Oh man, well, it's always a hard question when people ask me that because I don't just sit there and work on it. I do it in my spare time. Like I'm doing there's actually another video I want to show y'all of stuff I'm working on. I'm right now working on a lot of augmented reality and also just exploring more in 3D printing, which I can show y'all. So this is the Joshua Glover piece, 3D printed.
Wow.
I'm also part of a residency called Monument Lab and the Goethe Institute as well. Just have a lot of projects on the go. So I've been dedicating at least 2-3 hours to the piece. So I guess collectively I've spent about 10 hours since he passed away. In terms of the program that I use ZBrush, which is the program that I just showed you, Cinema 4D, and also After Effects, and also Adobe Illustrator as well. You can do 3D creations in pretty much all Adobe software, except for maybe InDesign. I do think we should absolve, not necessarily remove Black History Month, but I think we should absolve it because it should be included in all of our histories. In a sense of like, anytime we do history class, starting from grade kindergarten all the way to the end of university, we should constantly be learning about Canadian history because just the fact that almost everyone said they didn't know who Matthew DaCosta is just shows you the disservice that Black History Month is doing. I think Black History Month is not enough. That's what I'm basically trying to say. It's not enough just to focus on 29 days, 28 days sometimes. It needs to be year-wide long. Black History Month is one of the most stressful months for me because everyone is calling you on January to do something in February and everyone's trying to just get you to just like employ you. But then after that month ends, you're kind of discarded. I do think Black History Month is not doing enough. I think it's important to have the history stretched out because of so much, right? When we talk about Black History Month, because with Black History Month, we often just speak about American history. Why do we know so much about Martin Luther King Jr., but we don't know about Dudley Laws, Walter Rodney? A lot of people don't even know who Marcus Garvey is. To me, that's crazy. Marcus Garvey is probably most important. Not most important. I mean, never say one person is more important than the other. But I think it's important for people to also choose who they want to learn about. But I think it needs to be a year-wide, ongoing dedication of learning, and a month is not enough. I do a lot of work with children, and that's one of my key focus, especially with the augmented reality piece that I'm working on, because children are so tech savvy nowadays. And so I wanted to use the augmented reality to further encourage education and to create learning about Black and contributions of Black Canadians to the Canadian landscape more engaging and fun. The augmented reality piece that I'm working on is almost like a game, learning about the ancestors. Emperor Haile Selassie, so important, you know, Kwame Nkrumah, a lot of these folks. So I can quickly show y'all the video of the augmented reality piece that I'm working on.
I think how cool that's going to be that your work is going to be seen by a new generation of young children of color actually seeing themselves represented. That's so important.
Absolutely.
In terms of affirmation of person.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you're definitely onto something there.
Thank you. Just quickly play this video. So one video is by my friend who I collaborated with. His name is Vince Fraser. Super dope artist from the UK. The other one is the one I'm working on right now. This is something I'm working on that is going to be released by the city of Toronto. And when you press on it, it will take, like each time you click it, it will show you a different Black leader. And this is another one that's with the Goethe Institute. It's in the streets of Montreal. It's called Ancestral Technofossil.
I really like the idea of using the augmented reality to bring this stuff to a location. It allows you to kind of do an end run around dealing with city councils and mayors, and you can make that stuff happen and do installations virtually anywhere you want.
Absolutely. So how did you get to work with the city? Thank you for the question. So I got to work with the city because they just reached out to me. There was a competition, a call out for the competition, and I responded to the competition. I submitted my work. Yeah, next thing I know, they announced that I was the winner of the competition. But I've been working with the city a few times because of all the programs and projects that I've been doing. And also I've done quite a few murals. Actually, one of the videos I wanted to show was one of the first murals I did back in 2009, and I was working with youth from the Junction. And then the third video I was going to show you was another interview where I was working with youth from Lawrence Heights when I was working on the mural that was at Yorkdale. If anyone been to Yorkdale, to the subway at Yorkdale, there's like the pillars outside the pickup area outside of the subway. But yeah, back in 2010, 2011, I worked with 7 youth to create that art piece. I mean, I was a youth too, so I'm speaking like I wasn't a youth, but they were fairly young and they were high school kids. And that was one of my most memorable public art pieces that I've did because of the impact on one particular individual. And I'm going to tell you the quick story. So, quick story is we're painting, and I realized I really think cross-generation is important, like cross-generation connection is important, especially coming from a place where connecting to your ancestors and elders is highly revered, especially within the Rasta community and Jamaican culture, paying respect to your elders. And I realized in the mural, we didn't have enough elders. Now, man, it would be great to have someone, a Black person who lived here for a long time to be in this mural, to be a part of this mural. And literally, as I said it, I looked over my shoulder, and there was this guy walking, and he's smiling, and he's whistling. He's just like, man, just like such a good vibe. Like, he looked like he came out of like a jazz movie, like Oscar Peterson's like pal or something, And he had like the straps, I don't know what you call them, the straps, and he just walking, he just had a whole rhythm, like so jazzy. I stopped him and excuse me, sir, excuse me. Yeah, the braces. I stopped him like I was like, excuse me, like, by any chance, are you from the Lawrence Heights neighborhood from Neptune? He's like, yeah, I've been here for 50 years, and I've saw so many changes, and he starts telling us stories, and I'm like, oh, whoa, this is the guy. In my mind, I'm like, this is the guy. So he starts talking, and then like, I'm like, yo, is it possible? Would you be interested? Like, can we have you in the mural? Like, can we take a picture and put you in the mural? He's like, no problem, man. I would be honored, And so he had a cigarette in his hand, and he was about to smoke the cigarette. And I'm like, can you, like, is it okay if we ditch the cigarette? Just be natural. He's like, no problem. He throws away the cigarette. He's like, I don't even like smoking anyways. He takes a picture, and then he basically like just leans back and smiles, and it's like the amazing smile. His name is Felix. Boom, everyone was excited about putting him in the mural because it was just like perfect. And then he told us about another elder who also used to do barbecues in the community, and so we put her in the mural, and that was amazing. So opening day, he comes and he has all his grandkids with him, maybe about 12 little kids, like grandkids, and then the adults with him, and then we didn't see him for a while, and he's like, yo, you know what, I have to thank you. And I'm like, for what? And he's like, yo, you saved my life. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm so confused. Like, how could I save this old man's life just by having him in the mural? And he says to me, that day, he was told that he had terminal cancer in his lungs. And the doctor told him the next cigarette that he would smoke could kill him. And just as he was about to take the drag of his last cigarette, ready to kill himself, essentially, I stopped him. Not knowing that, like, me asking him to take that picture gave him a reason to fight and to live. He went on to live for a couple more years and he passed away. But his family was so grateful. Like, for a very long time, they actually held a memorial at the mural. You know, his grandkids and his great grandkids. Yeah, that was. Sorry, I get emotional talking about it because it's like to know that art can do that for someone, and then also for the grandkids to see their grandfather's story being preserved. You know, made me realize I was making the right choice to be an artist and to continue to tell these stories because it's not about me. It's more the next generation. That mural always will be a huge reminder of why I do what I do. Even though the mural is falling apart, I still got pictures of it. I still keep in touch with the family as well from time to time. They always thank me for that mural, and I'm just like, man. Sometimes it's so important to listen to your intuition, and I'm glad that I did.
Wow, that was a fantastic story. That was incredible. I remember when you were working on that. Oh, Chelina had her kids watching. She's very glad that they
Yeah,
got to watch. That's awesome.
thank you.
We're so blessed to have had you here today, Quentin. And I think I can say on behalf of everyone, it was really eye-opening. It was inspirational. And I'm sure this really resonated with a lot of people here in the room today. Thank you so much.